Good morning. This will be a slightly quick video today because I'm still in, as you see in a second, Rishikesh in the foothills of the Himalayas in India, and I got up early to make this video before it becomes incredibly crowded, but it's still a difficult time to make the video. But I'm just going to come down now and show you where I had a swim in the Ganges yesterday. Which you can see just behind me there. And even though it's very early in the morning, still people up. You can see on the other side of the beach over there are people up already praying by the Ganges. So I'll do this video slightly different to normal because it's going to be very difficult to film. And today I'm going to go to the Shivananda ashram and the Beatles ashram to have a look. So what I might do is film some Rishikesh and then put the audio over the top, which is kind of a fun way of doing it. But I'll take you for a walk through some of Rishikesh and then add the audio on later. So then I get a chance to go and see the Shivananda and the Beatles ashram, because one of the things I've been doing here is learning some advanced yoga and meditation techniques. And meditation for me, now that I'm making some inroads into what's previously been difficult for me, is now a non-negotiable first thing in the morning. So whatever's going on in my life, I'm not missing that early morning meditation. I'm also, I think, in the world capital of the Royal Enfield motorbike, which is pretty cool because I'm a motorbike enthusiast, and my dad used to ride Indian motorbikes when he was in the army. It's all very Royal Enfield around here. A motorbike really well suited to the conditions of the mountains here. So this video is all over the place because I'm now sitting on a rooftop of a very small hotel in Vrindavan, dodging the rain. Vrindavan's about 100 kilometers, I think it's north of Delhi, after I left Rishikesh yesterday. Kind of the rooftop reminds me of the great scene in the amazing movie called Monsoon Wedding, where the wedding planner went home to see his mother. Great movie to see if you haven't seen it, particularly if you're a parent. And this is India. I wrote yesterday that Rishikesh is a divine melting pot of movement, beauty, devotion, love, surrender, fearlessness, and radical optimism. And that's why people love coming to India. The magic is in the chaos, as with this video. Plus, finishing the audio here will allow me to more accurately and succinctly describe my hypothesis that I am both testing and refining with these videos. There are 5 parts to the hypothesis. 1 is that science and spirituality are converging, not diverging. 2, our 1 quadrillion mitochondria are both receivers and transmitters of light and electromagnetic frequency information. 3, the communication is not just internal but also external with nature and a creative intelligence. And one point that will become clear in these videos is that the more science proves the complexity of cellular function, the less likely it becomes, in my opinion, that it was all a pure accident that happened once in 15 billion years and has never happened again. And it's more likely that there was a creative intelligence involved. Otherwise, it's like finding a Rolex watch on the footpath, wondering how it all just accidentally assembled itself. Point 4 of my hypothesis is that lifestyle factors and environmental toxins damage the mitochondria and blunt our ability to communicate. And point 5 is that a healthy lifestyle and spiritual practices can improve mitochondrial function, increasing our ability to communicate with each other, nature and spirit. But as usual, we'll start with 2 fearless quotes about fearlessness from the spiritual literature. First one's a biblical quote from Luke, and it says, "No one lights a lamp and puts it in a place where it will be hidden. Instead, they put it on its stand so that those who come in may see the light." And the second quote comes from my yoga teacher. His name's Anand Malhotra, and he writes, "You can't have fear and faith in the same bucket." Oh, and just because of the way I described my hypothesis in this video, I'll put in a quote as well from Nick Lane, who's a scientist who writes about mitochondria, and he writes, quote, "The acquisition of mitochondria is the pivotal moment in history of life. Eukaryote endosymbiosis happened only once in 5 billion years." So let's continue our series on mitochondrial science, and previously I've stated we can divide all life forms into 2 groups. One is bacteria, known as prokaryotes, and the second is everything else, which we call eukaryotes. And that all the eukaryotes, all animals, plants, fungi, came from one bacteria that engulfed another bacteria in an event that we call endosymbiosis, which allowed multicellular life through increased energy efficiency. We're going to talk about that in more detail later on, but there are no multicellular bacteria. Bacteria live as isolated cells, and through increasing energy efficiency by developing mitochondria, that's essentially what allowed the development of multicellular life. However, this is where we're going to throw a spanner into the works a little bit. For endosymbiosis to work, we need to introduce a third component to the eukaryote and prokaryote classification, an intermediary. And these little organisms are called archaea. Remember last week we said that the cell wall is the critical component of the bacteria because it provides it with structural integrity, without which the bacteria would collapse. And in fact, many antibiotics, including penicillin, work by irreversibly damaging the bacterial cell wall. Animal cells have no cell wall because our cells need to be compressible and non-rigid to get through blood vessels and small spaces. Now these new bacteria, well, they're not new, this classification of bacteria I've just introduced to you, they look very much like bacteria under a microscope, but they have no cell wall. Archaea is the Greek word for ancient, and archaea either have no cell wall or a cell wall which is very structurally different to a normal bacterial cell wall. They do, however, have components or lack of components which make them very like bacteria, and that's the fact that they don't have a nuclear membrane, they're unicellular, they don't have any mitochondria, and they have circular chromosomes as compared to our linear chromosomes. They are what we call extremophiles, which means they thrive in extreme environments. Like, they like living in places like boiling acid, oil fields, hot springs, and incredibly salty water. And they have unique genes and unique ways of obtaining energy, but they also have a lot of similarity with eukaryote cells. Yet none of the extremophiles engulf food by phagocytosis, which is what our cells do, where the cell membrane wraps itself around the food and brings it into the cell. And so what we're going to look at next week in more detail is the theory. And I'll explain why it's very, very difficult to say one bacteria engulfed another bacteria. And I'll go through the reasons for that next week. But it is much easier to explain how an archaea engulfed a bacteria and developed a hybrid model which went on to become the first eukaryote. So that's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to have a look at the science of how the bacteria and the archaea may have got together to form the cell which science thinks came together to form the first eukaryote cell, being the common ancestor of every plant, animal and fungi. Then we'll start plugging this all into the hypothesis that I started at the beginning of this video. Okay, so let's go on and have a quick look at this week's 2 scientific mitochondrial papers. As usual, I'll put the screenshots of the studies at the end of the video for you to check up on. The first study was about mitochondria and inflammatory joint diseases like osteoarthritis, like SLE, which is systemic lupus erythematosus, and like scleroderma. And what the paper found was that mitochondria are intimately involved in the inflammation in those conditions. And that happens because, as we've discussed before, that there is damage to the inner mitochondrial membrane by multiple factors, including environmental toxins. That damage to the inner mitochondrial membrane causes mitochondrial dysfunction, and you get electron spilling and increased free radical production by those damaged mitochondria. Remember, it's like passing electrons along an electric cable without the protective wiring, so you're getting electricity spilling from the wire, causing damage. And the main damage occurs at cytochrome 1 or respiratory protein 1, which you'll see on my fantastic diagram that I'll put here. And when the free radicals are created and spill out that area, that's where they're closest to the mitochondrial DNA, so you start to get mitochondrial DNA mutations. And over the next couple of months, we're going to look at the critical role in mitochondrial DNA mutations in cancer. But today, it's about inflammatory joint diseases. Now, of course, science has come up for a great term with this, shortened to DAMP, which stands for damage-associated molecular pattern, but it's those DAMPs which they say are causing the inflammatory response, which is causing the inflammation in these systemic joint diseases. Now, of course, that would then give us a way of helping those, which is, and this is what the paper suggests, it suggests keeping the mitochondria as healthy as possible, which is what these videos are about. It also shines a light on what we talked about last week, which was uncoupling, where you can uncouple proton pumping across the inner mitochondrial membrane, which by producing heat rather than energy. So instead of pumping and overwhelming that damaged inner mitochondrial membrane more by pumping more protons across it, producing more work for it to do, instead you use those protons to not produce more ATP at the 5th respiratory protein, ATPase, but you use it by causing them to leak across the inner mitochondrial membrane by changing the polarization of the inner mitochondrial membrane and causing those protons to leak before they get to ATPase, and therefore producing heat rather than energy. That takes the pressure off the electron flow in the inner mitochondrial membrane, and therefore it's not going to cause as much free radical formation at respiratory protein 1. So again, we talked about how there are some medications that help with uncoupling, but the one that I use most, or the 2 I use most, are fasting, which definitely increases mitochondrial uncoupling, and also cold water thermogenesis, which is why you often see me getting into cold water, which increases my mitochondrial uncoupling by diverting my protons to produce heat rather than ATPA and taking the pressure off my inner mitochondrial membrane. You might have to listen to that bit a few times because it is quite complex, I suppose, but that's why I do those drawings for you to try and help you visualize it as well. Now this is also relevant to the second paper which came out recently, which was about mitochondrial function and depression, and they were making the case that a big part of depression is related to mitochondrial dysfunction. And I think that also comes back to my hypothesis too, because if you've got damage to the mitochondria, as we discussed, you have a less ability, according to my hypothesis, to communicate with the creative intelligence. And some people might think that could cause some mood disorders, because this paper also suggests that mitochondria can contribute to the diagnosis of depression through mitochondrial DNA mutations, through impaired mitophagy, which is the production of more mitochondria, because there's a turnover of these 1 quadrillion mitochondria as some get damaged and they get replaced by new ones, by decreased mitogenesis, which is the formation of more mitochondria, and by reduced function, reduced energy production of the damaged mitochondria. And in the paper, they suggested that coenzyme Q10 that we've discussed before, NAD precursors, which I've just discussed before in a previous video, exercise, a ketogenic diet, photobiomodulation, which is the use of red, infrared and far infrared light to improve mitochondrial function, are possible treatments therefore for depression. So if you've got something out of the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up on YouTube, otherwise the information doesn't get disseminated, and subscribing to the YouTube channel also helps get the information out there. And I personally, but I'm biased, think the information is incredibly important. Also, remember, none of this is medical or health advice or financial advice. I don't give advice on anything. It's just a man walking and talking in the wilderness, this time but beside one of the greatest rivers in the world, the Ganges, in very windy conditions. So make sure you read this medical disclaimer and watch the more detailed medical disclaimer at the end of the video. Okay, that's enough for me. Just remember that no matter how much it hurts, how dark it gets, or how far you fall, you are never out of the fight, particularly when you're standing next to the Mother Ganges River. And remember that after nearly 6 years I remain suspended in nutritional environmental medicine and can only work as an emergency specialist in a public hospital. So none of this is health or medical advice, and certainly does not replace a professional relationship with your own healthcare provider. And just because I go jumping in freezing cold water doesn't mean anybody else should without adequate training in the hormetic principles of contrast therapy. Let's take a holiday.